At 10:35 a.m., on September 30, 1999, 3 workers at the JCO uranium processing facility in Tokaimura, Japan, completed what they considered a routine uranyl nitrate preparation. They had dissolved uranium oxide powder enriched to 18.8% U-235 and transferred approximately 16.6 kilograms of solution into a precipitation tank designed to safely handle 2.4 kilograms maximum. The operation violated government-approved procedures, but followed efficiency modifications that had become standard practice over several years. The facility operated under a regulatory license stating there was no possibility of criticality accident occurrence due to malfunction and other failures. No criticality accident alarm system was required or installed. The fundamental contradiction lay not in equipment malfunction or operator negligence, but in the gap between regulatory assumptions and physical reality. The licensing framework assumed that administrative controls alone could prevent criticality, making engineered detection systems unnecessary. Workers acted according to procedures they had modified for production efficiency, unaware that their changes had eliminated critical mass control barriers. When the cylindrical precipitation tank reached critical mass, the sustained nuclear chain reaction began without immediate detection, continuing for approximately 20 hours and exposing workers and residents to significant radiation. This analysis examines how design philosophy, procedural drift, and regulatory assumptions combined to create conditions where a predictable physical event became an uncontrolled accident. The investigation reveals that the failure originated not from random errors, but from systematic vulnerabilities embedded within the facility's operational framework, vulnerabilities that made the accident both preventable and, under the existing conditions, inevitable. The Japan Atomic Energy Agency's Nuclear Fuel Cycle Engineering Laboratories operated the JCO facility under a conversion license granted in 1984, authorizing production of uranyl nitrate solutions with uranium enrichment below 20%. The facility's safety philosophy rested on the principle that criticality could be prevented through administrative controls, mass limitation, procedural compliance, and geometric constraints built into process equipment. This approach reflected standard practice in fuel cycle facilities where the double contingency principle required that at least 2 independent failures must occur simultaneously before a criticality accident could develop. The approved process flow required uranium oxide dissolution in a dedicated dissolution tank, followed by transfer to a buffer column with criticality-safe geometry for homogenization, then measured transfer to the precipitation tank. The buffer column's narrow cylindrical design prevented accumulation of sufficient fissile material to achieve critical mass, serving as the primary engineered barrier against criticality. Mass control procedures limited individual batch sizes to 2.4 kilograms uranium, ensuring that even procedural violations could not easily result in dangerous accumulations. The regulatory licensing review had concluded that the combination of these administrative and engineered controls made criticality accidents incredible. The Science and Technology Agency's safety evaluation stated explicitly that there was no possibility of criticality accident occurrence due to malfunction and other failures. This determination exempted the facility from requirements for criticality accident alarm systems, emergency planning specific to criticality events, and inclusion in Japan's National Plan for the Prevention of Nuclear Disasters. The regulatory framework treated the JCO operation as inherently safe through design, requiring only periodic compliance verification rather than continuous safety oversight. This design philosophy created several critical vulnerabilities that would later prove decisive. First, the absence of criticality detection systems meant that any actual criticality would continue undetected until external symptoms became obvious, typically after significant radiation exposure had already occurred. Second, emergency response procedures did not address criticality scenarios, since such events were deemed impossible. Third, worker training emphasized procedural compliance without explaining the underlying criticality safety principles that made those procedures necessary. The facility's instrumentation reflected these assumptions. Radiation monitors designed for routine contamination detection could identify elevated gamma levels but provided no specific indication of neutron flux or criticality conditions. The precipitation tank itself contained no nuclear instrumentation, neutron absorbers, or geometric features designed to prevent or terminate criticality. Water cooling jackets surrounded the tank to remove heat from chemical reactions, but this design inadvertently provided neutron reflection that could enhance criticality conditions under certain circumstances. Operator training focused on chemical processing procedures and general radiation safety, but provided minimal education about criticality physics, or the specific hazards associated with different uranium enrichment levels. Workers understood that mass limits existed and that procedural deviations were discouraged, but they lacked detailed knowledge of why these controls were critical or how violations might lead to nuclear chain reactions. This training approach was consistent with the regulatory assumption that strict procedural compliance would prevent any credible path to criticality. The approved process design incorporated several layers of protection. The dissolution tank's geometry prevented criticality during initial mixing. The buffer column's narrow diameter maintained subcritical conditions during homogenization, and mass transfer limits ensured that the precipitation tank never received dangerous quantities of fissile material. Each step included verification requirements and documentation protocols intended to maintain accountability and prevent procedural drift. However, the effectiveness of this multi-layered approach depended entirely on strict adherence to approved procedures. The system contained no tolerance for operational modifications, equipment substitutions, or process shortcuts. Any significant deviation from the prescribed flow path could potentially compromise criticality safety, but the regulatory framework provided no mechanism for evaluating such changes or detecting them once implemented. This inflexibility became a critical weakness when production pressures encouraged efficiency improvements that circumvented safety barriers. The precipitation tank's design reflected the assumption that it would never receive more than 2.4 kilograms uranium in a single batch. Its cylindrical geometry, 45 centimeters diameter with water cooling jacket, was not optimized for criticality safety, but for chemical processing efficiency. The vessel provided adequate heat removal for normal operations but included no features to prevent or mitigate nuclear chain reactions. Its size and shape could easily accommodate critical masses of enriched uranium if procedural controls failed, a possibility that regulatory analysis had dismissed as incredible. The fundamental design premise that administrative controls could reliably prevent criticality established the conditions for subsequent failure. This assumption eliminated redundant safeguards, reduced oversight requirements, and created organizational confidence that criticality accidents simply could not occur. When this premise proved incorrect, the facility possessed no backup systems to detect, control, or mitigate the consequences of its failure. The erosion of safety margins at the JCO facility began years before the September 1999 accident, rooted in economic pressures and organizational factors that gradually normalized procedural deviations. International competition in uranium processing had significantly impacted JCO's financial position, with company revenues declining from 3.25 billion yen in 1991 to 1.72 billion yen in 1998. This economic stress prompted management efficiency initiatives, including workforce reduction that cut technical staff from 34 to 20 personnel. The reduction in experienced operators occurred simultaneously with increased pressure to maintain production schedules with fewer resources. The company's response to these pressures exemplified the Japanese business concept of Kaizen, continuous improvement through incremental changes. While Kaizen culture had proven successful in manufacturing industries, its application at JCO focused primarily on production efficiency and cost reduction rather than safety enhancement. Workers were encouraged to identify process improvements and streamline operations, creating an organizational environment where procedural modifications were viewed positively rather than as potential safety hazards. The most significant manifestation of this culture appeared in 1996 when JCO developed an unauthorized revision to its uranium processing procedures. The original government-approved process required dissolution of uranium oxide in the dedicated dissolution tank, but workers had found this method slower and more cumbersome than direct dissolution in portable stainless steel buckets. The bucket method eliminated several process steps and allowed more flexible handling of different batch sizes, appearing to offer clear efficiency advantages without obvious safety penalties. The 1996 procedure revision was internally reviewed and approved by JCO's Manufacturing Division and Quality Assurance Division, but significantly, it was not reviewed by the Safety Management Division or submitted to regulatory authorities for approval. This omission reflected both the company's confidence that the changes were benign and a broader organizational assumption that minor procedural adjustments did not require external oversight. Company spokesmen later admitted they did not submit the revised procedure to regulators because they believed approval would be denied, yet they proceeded with implementation regardless. The revised procedure eliminated the dissolution tank entirely, substituting 10-liter stainless steel buckets for uranium oxide dissolution and homogenization. This change removed the first engineered barrier against criticality, the dissolution tank's geometric constraints that prevented accumulation of critical masses during initial processing. Workers adapted quickly to the bucket method, which became standard practice for most uranium processing operations. Over time, the original approved procedure was effectively abandoned in favor of the more efficient, unauthorized version. This procedural drift was facilitated by inadequate internal oversight mechanisms. The Facilities Safety Committee had responsibility for reviewing operational changes, but its authority was limited and its focus divided among multiple priorities. Following a 1992 organizational restructuring, key personnel held concurrent positions that created potential conflicts of interest. The Safety Control Manager simultaneously served as Quality Control Manager, inevitably emphasizing quality and production concerns over safety considerations. The Safety Committee lost jurisdiction over accident investigation, further reducing its influence on operational practices. The absence of independent technical oversight allowed these changes to proceed without adequate safety analysis. No formal evaluation was conducted to determine whether the bucket dissolution method maintained equivalent criticality safety margins compared to the approved process. No consideration was given to the cumulative effect of multiple procedural modifications or their potential interaction with other operational factors. The company's internal audit program failed to identify these unauthorized changes as safety concerns, treating them instead as acceptable efficiency improvements. Worker training and qualification programs reflected these organizational priorities. Personnel received instruction on chemical processing techniques and general radiation protection. But criticality safety education was minimal and focused primarily on adherence to procedural limits, rather than understanding the underlying physics. Workers understood that uranium mass limits existed, and that certain enrichment levels required special handling, but they lacked detailed knowledge of how these factors related to nuclear chain reaction potential. This training approach was particularly problematic for operations involving intermediate enrichment uranium, above 5% but below 20%, U-235. The facility primarily processed low-enrichment material for power reactor fuel, with only occasional orders for higher enrichment levels. Workers had extensive experience with low-enrichment processing but limited familiarity with the enhanced criticality hazards associated with intermediate enrichment levels. They understood that different enrichment levels required different procedures, but training did not emphasize the dramatic differences in critical mass requirements between 3 to 5% and 18.8% enriched uranium. The organizational culture that emerged from these factors created what investigators later termed production improvement drives that prioritized operational efficiency over conservative safety practices. Workers felt empowered to modify procedures based on their practical experience, viewing such improvements as beneficial contributions to company performance. Management generally supported these initiatives, particularly when they demonstrated cost savings or schedule improvements without apparent safety penalties. The September 1999 production order for Joyo reactor fuel created additional pressure that would prove decisive. This specialized product required 18.8% enriched uranium, a significant departure from the facility's normal processing range. The order came during a period of reduced staffing and financial pressure, when the company was eager to demonstrate capability for profitable specialized work. Of the 3 workers assigned to the operation, 2 had never processed intermediate enrichment uranium, and the third had only several months of relevant experience. Special restart authorization was required for this operation despite the facility not having processed similar material for approximately 3 years. No additional training was provided to familiarize workers with the enhanced criticality risks associated with higher enrichment levels. No supervisory oversight was assigned to ensure strict adherence to procedural limits during this unfamiliar operation. The institutional assumption that procedural compliance would automatically ensure safety eliminated perceived need for such precautions. The facility's alarm and monitoring systems reflected these organizational blind spots. Radiation detection equipment was designed for routine contamination monitoring and general area surveillance but provided no specific capability to detect nuclear criticality conditions. Alarm set points and response procedures were based on conventional radiation hazards rather than the unique signature of nuclear chain reactions. Emergency response plans addressed chemical spills, fires, and routine radiation exposures, but contained no provisions for criticality accidents, since such events were considered impossible. The cumulative effect of these latent conditions created an organizational environment where unauthorized procedural modifications had become normalized, safety oversight was inadequate, and workers lacked sufficient knowledge to recognize when their actions might create criticality hazards. The facility operated under a false assumption of safety based on regulatory determinations that no longer reflected actual operational practices. These conditions established a predictable pathway to failure. Economic pressure encouraged procedural shortcuts that eliminated safety margins. Inadequate oversight allowed unauthorized changes to accumulate without evaluation. Insufficient training left workers unable to recognize criticality hazards. Missing detection systems ensured that any actual criticality would continue uncontrolled until external symptoms became obvious. When the September 30 operation began, these latent failures had already created the necessary preconditions for a criticality accident. The remaining question was not whether the system was vulnerable, but rather when operational circumstances would align to exploit that vulnerability. The sequence of events that began on September 29, 1999, appeared routine to the 3 JCO workers assigned to produce uranyl nitrate solution for the Joyo Fast research reactor. The operation required processing uranium oxide powder enriched to 18.8% U-235, a significantly higher enrichment level than the facility's typical 3-5% material. But the workers approached it using their established modified procedures. They dissolved the uranium oxide directly in 10-liter stainless steel buckets using nitric acid, bypassing the approved dissolution tank entirely. This deviation from licensed procedures had become standard practice since 1996, reflecting the company's unauthorized efficiency improvements. The approved process flow specified a carefully controlled sequence designed to maintain criticality safety through geometric and mass controls. Uranium oxide dissolution was to occur in the dissolution tank, a vessel with dimensions and internal geometry calculated to prevent accumulation of critical masses. The dissolved solution would then transfer to a buffer column, a narrow cylindrical vessel with criticality-safe geometry, for homogenization through nitrogen gas purging. Only after homogenization and verification would measured quantities transfer to the precipitation tank for final chemical processing. The workers' actual procedure eliminated these engineered safeguards entirely. They dissolved uranium oxide directly in portable buckets, mixed the solution manually, and poured it directly into the precipitation tank for homogenization. This approach removed both the dissolution tank's geometric constraints and the buffer column's mass control function, concentrating the entire safety margin on administrative limits that were not independently verified or enforced. On September 29th, the workers successfully completed 4 batches using this unauthorized method, transferring approximately 26 liters of uranyl nitrate solution containing about 10.4 kilograms uranium to the precipitation tank. The operation proceeded without incident, reinforcing their confidence that the bucket method was both efficient and safe. They planned to complete the remaining 3 batches the following morning, bringing the total uranium content to the 16.6 kilograms specified in the production order. The critical divergence occurred on the morning of September 30th, when the workers resumed operations to complete the final 3 batches. At this point, the precipitation tank already contained a substantial quantity of enriched uranium solution from the previous day's work. The addition of each new batch incrementally increased both the total uranium mass and the overall concentration within the tank's cylindrical geometry. Neither the workers nor their supervisors recognized that this sequential batch addition was creating conditions that approached critical mass thresholds. The precipitation tank itself was never designed to serve as a mixing or homogenization vessel for large quantities of enriched uranium. Its cylindrical configuration, 45 centimeters internal diameter with a water cooling jacket, was optimized for chemical precipitation processes using small subcritical batches. When used for homogenization of multiple accumulated batches, the tank's geometry became problematic from a criticality standpoint. Its dimensions could easily accommodate critical masses of 18.8% enriched uranium under properly moderated conditions. The workers' understanding of criticality safety was based primarily on their experience with low-enrichment uranium processing, where mass limits provided substantial safety margins. They knew that procedures specified maximum batch sizes and total accumulation limits, but they lacked detailed knowledge of how these limits related to actual critical mass calculations. More importantly, they did not understand how dramatically critical mass requirements decreased with higher enrichment levels. The transition from 3 to 5% to 18.8% enriched uranium represented a qualitative change in criticality hazard that was not reflected in their training or operational awareness. As the final batches were added on September 30th, the uranium concentration and total mass in the precipitation tank steadily approached conditions where nuclear chain reactions could become self-sustaining. The solution contained approximately 16.6 kilograms uranium enriched to 18.8% U-235, well beyond the facility's licensed mass limits. The cylindrical tank geometry, surrounded by water cooling jackets that could act as neutron reflectors, provided favorable conditions for criticality once critical mass thresholds were exceeded. The moment of divergence between intended safety controls and physical reality occurred at approximately 10:35 a.m. when the 7th and final batch was added to the precipitation tank. The total uranium mass reached approximately 16 kilograms, containing roughly 3 kilograms of U-235 in a concentrated aqueous solution. Under the geometric and moderation conditions present in the precipitation tank, this quantity exceeded the critical mass necessary to sustain nuclear chain reactions. The initial criticality manifested as an intense burst of neutron and gamma radiation lasting several seconds, followed by a sustained lower-level chain reaction that would continue for nearly 20 hours. The 3 workers in the immediate vicinity received massive radiation exposures ranging from 1 to 4.5 Gray equivalent to 16 to 20 Gray equivalent, with the closest worker receiving a lethal dose. The initial burst was detected by area gamma monitors, which triggered general radiation alarms throughout the facility. However, the facility possessed no criticality-specific detection systems that could identify the unique neutron signature of nuclear chain reactions or distinguish criticality events from other radiation sources. The gamma monitors indicated elevated radiation levels but provided no information about the nature or source of the radiation. Workers and supervisors initially assumed the alarms indicated a conventional radiation leak or contamination event rather than an ongoing nuclear criticality. This detection failure created a critical information gap during the most dangerous phase of the accident. The sustained criticality continued to produce intense neutron and gamma radiation, but facility personnel had no means to confirm that nuclear chain reactions were ongoing or to assess the magnitude of the hazard. Emergency response procedures designed for conventional radiation incidents were inadequate for criticality events, leading to confusion and delays that extended exposure durations. The precipitation tank's water cooling system, originally installed to remove chemical reaction heat, inadvertently contributed to sustaining the criticality. by providing neutron reflection that enhanced the neutron economy within the fissile solution. The cooling water remained in operation throughout the initial hours of the accident, maintaining conditions that supported continued nuclear chain reactions. This design interaction was not anticipated in either the original safety analysis or the modified procedures that led to the accident. The physical processes occurring within the precipitation tank followed predictable nuclear engineering principles. The concentrated uranyl nitrate solution contained sufficient fissile material to achieve and maintain criticality under the existing geometric and moderation conditions. Neutron production from fission reactions balanced neutron losses through absorption and leakage, creating a steady-state chain reaction that continued until external intervention disrupted the neutron balance. The workers' actions during the batch addition process were entirely consistent with their training and experience using the modified procedures. They followed established patterns for uranium dissolution and transfer, applied mixing techniques they had used successfully in previous operations, and completed the work according to their understanding of production requirements. Their decisions were logical and appropriate given the information available to them and the procedural framework under which they operated. The fundamental divergence lay not in operator error or equipment malfunction, but in the gap between regulatory assumptions and operational reality. The facility's safety analysis assumed strict adherence to approved procedures that would prevent accumulation of critical masses. The actual modified procedures eliminated key safety barriers while maintaining an appearance of controlled operation. When physical laws governing nuclear chain reactions encountered conditions that exceeded critical thresholds, the predictable result was sustained criticality regardless of administrative intentions or procedural compliance. The nuclear chain reaction that began at 10:35 a.m. initiated a sequence of physical processes that followed established principles of reactor physics, but occurred in a system never designed to contain or control such reactions. The initial criticality burst released an intense pulse of neutrons and gamma radiation that lasted approximately 20 seconds, producing an estimated 2.5 hex 10 to the power of 17 fissions and depositing substantial energy within the uranyl nitrate solution. This prompt critical excursion was followed by a transition to delayed critical conditions, where the chain reaction continued at a lower but sustained level for the next 20 hours. The physics governing this sustained criticality were straightforward, but had devastating implications for exposure control. The precipitation tank contained approximately 40 liters of uranyl nitrate solution with uranium enriched to 18.8% U-235, providing a total of roughly 3 kilograms of fissile isotope. Under the geometric conditions present, a cylindrical vessel 45 centimeters in diameter surrounded by water cooling jackets, this quantity significantly exceeded the critical mass necessary to maintain nuclear chain reactions. The water jackets, originally installed for chemical process cooling, acted as neutron reflectors that effectively increased the neutron economy and reduced the critical mass requirements. The sustained reaction operated at thermal power levels estimated between 0.1 and 1 kilowatt, continuously producing neutrons and gamma radiation at levels far exceeding those from any radioactive source typically encountered in fuel processing facilities. The neutron flux within and around the precipitation tank reached approximately 10 to the power of 8 neutrons per square centimeter per second, creating an intensely hazardous radiation environment that extended well beyond the immediate work area. The absence of neutron-absorbing materials within the solution or surrounding the tank meant that nothing inherently limited the chain reaction once critical conditions were established. Unlike nuclear reactors equipped with control rods and neutron-absorbing systems, the precipitation tank contained only uranyl nitrate solution in water, materials that supported, rather than controlled nuclear chain reactions. The reaction would continue indefinitely unless external intervention altered the neutron balance through drainage, dilution, or poison injection. Temperature effects within the solution created a weak negative feedback mechanism that provided some stability to the reaction rate, but did not terminate the chain reaction. As the fission process deposited energy in the solution, temperature increases caused thermal expansion that slightly reduced uranium concentration and neutron moderation efficiency. This temperature coefficient prevented the reaction from escalating to higher power levels, but was insufficient to drive the system subcritical under the existing mass and geometric conditions. The radiation field surrounding the precipitation tank created multiple zones of extreme hazard that were not immediately recognized due to the facility's limited detection capabilities. Neutron dose rates at 1 meter from the tank exceeded 10 gray per hour, while gamma dose rates reached similar levels. These radiation levels were orders of magnitude higher than anything previously encountered at the facility and far exceeded the detection range of most installed monitoring equipment. The 3 workers who performed the final batch addition received the most severe exposures, with doses ranging from 1 to 4.5 gray equivalent for the supervisor to 16 to 20 gray equivalent for the worker closest to the tank during criticality onset. These exposures occurred within minutes of the initial burst and represented radiation doses that would prove fatal in the highest case and cause severe radiation syndrome in the others. The speed and magnitude of these exposures reflected both the intensity of the initial criticality burst and the worker's proximity to an unshielded nuclear radiation source. The facility's radiation monitoring systems detected elevated gamma levels but could not characterize the neutron component of the radiation field or distinguish criticality signatures from other potential sources. Area monitors designed for contamination detection and routine dose rate surveillance were overwhelmed by radiation levels that exceeded their measurement capabilities. Alarm systems provided general warnings of elevated radiation but offered no specific guidance for criticality emergency response. The continued operation of the cooling water system inadvertently sustained optimal conditions for the chain reaction by maintaining neutron reflection and removing excess heat that might otherwise have provided negative feedback. The cooling water circulated through jackets surrounding the precipitation tank, maintaining stable thermal conditions, while providing neutron reflection that enhanced the criticality. This cooling system would continue operating for nearly 16 hours before emergency responders recognized its role in sustaining the reaction. As the chain reaction continued, radioactive fission products accumulated within the uranyl nitrate solution and began to be released as gaseous effluents. Noble gases including xenon and krypton isotopes, along with volatile iodine compounds, escaped from the solution and were exhausted through the building's ventilation system. These releases created the first external evidence of nuclear fission processes and eventually triggered off-site radiation detection systems. The physical confinement provided by the precipitation tank and surrounding equipment was never designed to contain fission products or manage the thermal and radiation effects of nuclear chain reactions. The tank's structural integrity remained adequate throughout the event, but its chemical process design offered no provisions for radioactive gas management or radiation shielding. Ventilation systems designed for chemical fume control were inadequate for managing radioactive effluents and provided minimal filtration of fission product gases. The neutron activation of surrounding materials began creating additional radioactive sources that would complicate long-term recovery operations. Structural materials, equipment components, and even concrete shielding walls absorbed neutrons and became radioactive through activation processes. These secondary sources would continue producing radiation long after the primary chain reaction was terminated, extending contamination and exposure concerns well beyond the immediate accident period. Emergency response efforts during the initial hours were hindered by fundamental misunderstanding of the physical processes occurring. Responders initially treated the event as a conventional radiation accident involving contamination or source exposure, not recognizing that an ongoing nuclear chain reaction was continuously producing new radiation. This mischaracterization led to inappropriate response strategies that failed to address the root cause of the radiation production. The facility's emergency procedures contained no provisions for criticality accidents because such events had been determined to be impossible through regulatory analysis. Response protocols addressed chemical spills, fires, equipment failures, and conventional radiation exposures, but provided no guidance for situations involving sustained nuclear chain reactions. This procedural gap created dangerous confusion during the most critical phase of the emergency response. Workers and emergency responders who entered the building during the initial hours unknowingly exposed themselves to intense neutron and gamma radiation fields without appropriate protection or dosimetry. Standard radiation protection equipment and monitoring devices were inadequate for the neutron-rich environment created by the ongoing chain reaction. 24 emergency workers ultimately received measurable radiation exposures, with individual doses reaching 48 millisieverts. The physics of the accident followed predictable patterns established by decades of nuclear engineering experience, but occurred in a facility environment completely unprepared to recognize or respond to such phenomena. The sustained criticality represented a textbook demonstration of nuclear chain reaction principles, operating according to fundamental physical laws that were indifferent to regulatory assumptions about their impossibility. The recognition that a sustained nuclear chain reaction was occurring came gradually and incompletely, hampering initial stabilization efforts. The first indication that the radiation alarm represented more than a conventional leak emerged when facility personnel observed that radiation levels remained elevated hours after the initial event, contrary to expectations for contamination incidents or source exposures. However, the absence of criticality-specific detection equipment meant that responders could not definitively confirm ongoing fission processes or assess the magnitude of neutron production. Local emergency authorities were notified at 11:19 a.m., approximately 44 minutes after the initial criticality, but the report characterized the event as a general radiation emergency rather than a nuclear accident. This initial mischaracterization reflected both the facility's limited diagnostic capability and the institutional assumption that criticality accidents were impossible at fuel processing operations. Emergency response procedures activated were those designed for conventional radiation incidents, focusing on contamination control and personnel evacuation rather than termination of nuclear chain reactions. The first systematic attempt to address the ongoing chain reaction began around 2:30 a.m. on October 1st, nearly 16 hours after the initial criticality. Emergency responders had gradually recognized that conventional radiation sources could not account for the sustained, high dose rates observed around the conversion building. Nuclear engineering consultants brought to the scene confirmed that the radiation signatures were consistent with ongoing fission processes and recommended immediate action to disrupt the neutron balance within the precipitation tank. The primary stabilization strategy focused on eliminating neutron reflection by draining the water cooling system surrounding the precipitation tank. The water jackets that provided cooling for normal chemical operations also served as neutron reflectors that enhanced the neutron economy and reduced critical mass requirements. By removing this reflection, emergency teams hoped to drive the system subcritical through increased neutron leakage without requiring direct access to the highly radioactive precipitation tank. The water drainage operation presented significant technical and radiological challenges. Workers required access to cooling system valves located within the intense radiation field surrounding the tank, necessitating extremely brief exposures and careful coordination to minimize dose accumulation. Emergency responders used remote tools and shielding where possible, but some operations required direct human intervention in radiation fields exceeding 10 Gray per hour. The drainage process began at approximately 2:30 a.m. and required several hours to complete due to the distributed nature of the cooling system and the need for frequent personnel rotation to control radiation exposures. As water was removed from the jackets, neutron detection equipment borrowed from nearby research facilities began indicating decreased neutron flux levels, confirming that the reflection removal strategy was affecting the chain reaction. Complete termination of the chain reaction required additional intervention beyond water drainage alone. The uranium mass and concentration within the precipitation tank remained above critical thresholds even with reduced neutron reflection. Emergency teams prepared to inject neutron-absorbing boric acid solution directly into the tank to poison the chain reaction and ensure definitive shutdown. This operation required careful preparation due to the risk of creating additional radioactive contamination and the potential for chemical reactions between the boric acid and uranyl nitrate solutions. The boric acid injection began at approximately 6 a.m. on October 1st, using pumping equipment positioned outside the high radiation zone and connected to the precipitation tank through hastily installed piping. The injection process was monitored using portable neutron detection equipment to confirm that neutron production was decreasing as absorber concentration increased. Final confirmation that the chain reaction had terminated came at 6:15 a.m., approximately 20 hours after the initial criticality. Even after achieving physical shutdown of the chain reaction, significant radiological hazards persisted throughout the facility. Fission product gases continued to be released from the uranyl nitrate solution, requiring enhanced ventilation controls and air monitoring. Neutron activation of structural materials and equipment had created numerous secondary radiation sources that would require extensive decontamination efforts. The precipitation tank itself remained highly radioactive and would pose access control challenges for subsequent investigation and cleanup. The prolonged duration of the stabilization effort reflected several systemic failures beyond the initial criticality event. Emergency response procedures designed for conventional radiation incidents were inadequate for managing ongoing nuclear chain reactions. Detection equipment capable of characterizing neutron radiation fields and confirming criticality conditions was not readily available at the facility or through local emergency resources. Personnel with specialized knowledge of criticality physics and emergency termination techniques were not immediately accessible, requiring time-consuming consultation and coordination processes. During the stabilization period, additional workers and emergency responders received unplanned radiation exposures that could have been minimized with proper criticality emergency procedures. 24 emergency workers involved in response operations received individual doses up to 48 millisieverts, while other facility personnel and nearby residents were exposed to lower but measurable radiation levels. These exposures reflected both the extended duration of the emergency and the absence of established protocols for managing criticality-related radiation hazards. The technical success of the stabilization effort demonstrated that the chain reaction could be terminated through appropriate intervention, but also highlighted the vulnerability created by the facility's lack of criticality-specific emergency capabilities. The water drainage and boric acid injection techniques employed were standard approaches for criticality control, but their implementation required improvisation and external expertise that were not readily available during the critical initial hours of the emergency. Secondary radiological consequences emerged during and after the stabilization process. Gaseous fission products released during the 20-hour chain reaction period created detectable contamination in the surrounding environment, though at levels that posed minimal long-term health risks. Activated materials within the conversion building would require specialized handling and disposal procedures. The uranyl nitrate solution itself had been transformed into a complex mixture of uranium, fission products, and activation products that would present ongoing management challenges. The off-site radiological impact remained limited due to the containment provided by the conversion building and the relatively low power level of the sustained chain reaction. However, the potential for more severe consequences was evident in the evacuation of residents within 350 meters of the facility and the sheltering recommendation for approximately 310,000 people within 10 kilometers. These protective actions reflected appropriate caution given the uncertainty about potential escalation or additional releases, but also demonstrated the significant societal disruption that could result from criticality accidents at fuel cycle facilities. The stabilization phase revealed that while criticality accidents could be terminated through appropriate technical intervention, the consequences of delayed recognition and response were severe and long-lasting. The 20-hour duration of the chain reaction transformed what might have been a brief, localized event into a major radiological emergency with widespread impact. The absence of immediate termination capability magnified both the direct radiation exposures and the broader societal consequences of the accident. The forensic investigation that followed the Tokaimura criticality accident revealed systematic evidence of the physical processes that had occurred and documented the broader implications for nuclear fuel cycle safety worldwide. Post-accident analysis confirmed that the sustained chain reaction had operated predictably according to nuclear physics principles, validating theoretical models while simultaneously exposing critical gaps in regulatory oversight and facility design that extended far beyond the immediate accident site. Physical examination of the precipitation tank and surrounding equipment provided direct evidence of the nuclear processes that had occurred during the 20-hour criticality period. Neutron activation analysis of structural materials confirmed intense neutron flux levels that correlated with calculated values for sustained fission reactions. Activated components displayed characteristic isotope signatures that could only result from exposure to neutron fields generated by nuclear chain reactions, definitively establishing that sustained criticality had occurred rather than a brief excursion. Radiochemical analysis of the uranyl nitrate solution revealed the complete spectrum of fission products expected from U-235 fission, including both short-lived and long-lived isotopes in ratios consistent with the estimated duration and power level of the chain reaction. The presence of cesium-137, barium-140, iodine-131, and other characteristic fission products provided quantitative confirmation of the total number of fissions that had occurred. These measurements validated initial estimates of approximately 2.5 x 10 to the power of 17 total fissions during the accident sequence. The facility's radiation monitoring data, though limited by equipment capabilities, provided a chronological record of the accident progression that supported the physical evidence. Gamma radiation trends showed the characteristic pattern of an initial spike, followed by sustained elevated levels, consistent with prompt criticality, followed by continued fission product production. The gradual decline in radiation levels after termination reflected the expected decay of short-lived fission products, combined with the cessation of new fission events. Environmental monitoring conducted by Japanese regulatory authorities documented the extent and magnitude of radioactive releases during the accident. Airborne contamination measurements confirmed that gaseous fission products, primarily noble gases, and volatile iodine compounds had been released through the facility's ventilation system. However, total environmental releases remained relatively small due to the containment provided by the conversion building and the aqueous nature of the uranyl nitrate solution that retained most fission products. The most significant forensic finding was documentation of the systematic regulatory and organizational failures that had made the accident both predictable and preventable. The Nuclear Safety Commission's investigation identified 7 specific root causes that encompass technical, procedural, and institutional deficiencies. These findings demonstrated that the accident resulted not from random equipment failures or individual errors, but from systemic vulnerabilities embedded within Japan's nuclear fuel cycle regulatory framework. International review by the International Atomic Energy Agency confirmed that similar vulnerabilities existed at fuel processing facilities worldwide. The IAEA's fact-finding mission concluded that the Tokaimura accident reflected broader weaknesses in how criticality safety was regulated and implemented across the global nuclear fuel cycle industry. The assumption that administrative controls alone could prevent criticality accidents was shown to be inadequate when subjected to real-world operational pressures and human factors influences. The United States Nuclear Regulatory Commission's analysis, documented in their April 2000 review, systematically compared each identified root cause with existing U.S. regulatory requirements and oversight practices. While concluding that similar accidents were unlikely in U.S. facilities due to more stringent oversight and mandatory criticality alarm systems, the NRC acknowledged that the fundamental lessons about procedural drift and safety culture degradation were applicable internationally. Economic consequences of the accident provided quantitative evidence of the broader societal impact beyond direct radiological effects. JCO's compensation payments eventually exceeded $93 million, reflecting costs associated with evacuation, business interruption, agricultural losses, and psychological impacts on affected communities. These economic effects demonstrated that criticality accidents at fuel cycle facilities could have consequences far exceeding their immediate radiological footprint. The accident's impact on Japan's nuclear regulatory framework was immediate and comprehensive. The Science and Technology Agency implemented new requirements for criticality accident alarm systems at all fuel processing facilities handling enriched uranium. Enhanced inspection protocols were established to verify actual operational practices rather than relying solely on documented procedures. Training requirements were strengthened to ensure that workers understood criticality physics principles rather than merely following procedural steps. Long-term health monitoring of exposed workers provided crucial data on radiation effects at dose levels rarely encountered in peacetime nuclear operations. The worker who received 16 to 20 Gray equivalent died approximately 3 months after the accident from complications of acute radiation syndrome. The other 2 workers experienced severe but non-fatal radiation effects requiring extensive medical treatment. Their clinical courses provided valuable medical data while tragically demonstrating the human consequences of uncontrolled criticality events. The investigation revealed that criticality accidents represented a unique category of nuclear emergency that required specialized detection, analysis, and response capabilities, distinct from those adequate for conventional radiation incidents. Standard emergency planning based on contamination or source exposure scenarios was fundamentally inadequate for managing ongoing nuclear chain reactions. This finding prompted worldwide review of emergency preparedness requirements for fuel cycle facilities. Technical analysis demonstrated that the accident had been entirely preventable through proper implementation of existing criticality safety principles. The double contingency principle, properly applied, would have required multiple independent failures before critical conditions could develop. Appropriate geometric controls, mass limitations, and procedural safeguards were well-established technologies that could have prevented the accident if correctly implemented and maintained. The regulatory assumption that criticality accidents were incredible at fuel processing facilities was definitively refuted by the actual occurrence of sustained chain reactions under real operational conditions. This finding prompted fundamental reassessment of licensing criteria and safety analysis requirements for facilities handling significant quantities of enriched uranium. The concept of defense in depth was reinforced as essential for nuclear safety, requiring redundant barriers rather than reliance on single-point controls. International cooperation in sharing accident information and lessons learned was identified as a critical need for preventing similar events. The initial delay in providing detailed technical information to international partners had hindered global learning from the accident. Enhanced information sharing protocols were developed to ensure rapid dissemination of safety-significant information following any future nuclear accidents. The Tokaimura accident ultimately demonstrated that nuclear criticality represented a fundamental physical hazard that required active management through engineered systems and organizational controls. Passive reliance on administrative procedures without backup detection and mitigation systems was shown to be inadequate for managing this hazard under realistic operational conditions. The accident served as a definitive proof that assumptions about impossible failure modes could themselves become failure mechanisms when they eliminated necessary safeguards. The forensic evidence established that nuclear safety required not just technical adequacy, but also institutional vigilance to prevent the gradual erosion of safety margins through normalized procedural drift. The accident illustrated how economic pressures, organizational culture, and regulatory assumptions could combine to create conditions where well-understood hazards manifested in unexpected ways. These lessons extended far beyond criticality safety to encompass fundamental principles of high-hazard technology management.